How would you feel if someone you loved who went missing suddenly showed up again? Excited? Relieved? But what if after a while things started to feel a little wrong? Their voice is different, you don't remember their eyes being that color. This is exactly what happened to the family of Nicholas Barclay, a teenage boy who went missing from his home in Texas, then magically turned up in Europe. At first, his family was excited to have him home, but as Nicholas settled into his old life, those around him started to realize there was something weird about him. That's because he wasn't Nicholas Barclay at all. The person they let into their home was Frederick Borden, a serial imposter known by the press as the Chameleon. The Barclay family soon discovered that the man they thought was their missing son had pretended to be hundreds of missing people during his life. As Frederick's identity as Nicholas unraveled, the authorities couldn't understand something. How had the family not figured this out sooner? And if they had, why didn't they say anything? Let's dive in. Nicholas Patrick Barclay was born on December 31st, 1980. He grew up in San Antonio, Texas, where he lived with his mom, Beverly Dollarhide, and his two older siblings, Carrie and Jason. In their neighborhood, Nicholas had a reputation as kind of a wild child and was known to get in trouble. The cops always were at his house, and he pretty much never went to school, which nobody minded because when he was there, he just got into trouble. At the time of his disappearance, when he was just 13 years old, he already had 3 tattoos that he got from his friends. He was also known for being a runaway. On June 13th, 1994, Nicholas was spotted playing basketball outside with his friends. As the sun started to go down, he tried to call his mom to ask her to come pick him up. However, she was asleep, and when Jason answered the phone, instead he refused to wake her up, telling Nicholas to walk home. He was never heard from again. At first, nobody was worried about him. He ran off all the time. He'd be back once he got cold, tired, or hungry. Except he didn't. As the hours dragged on, there was still no sign of Nicholas, and his family decided to call the cops. When he left, Nicholas only had $5 with him, and he didn't take any extra clothes. Despite this, the police still weren't worried until more than a day had passed.
You spend 24 hours crying, sick, worried, then you get mad, then you get scared, and then you try to get empowered. Okay, what can we do? We have to do flyers, we'll do this, so instead of, you don't cry, you do something positive.
But no amount of searching or campaigning could bring Nicholas home. On September 25th, Jason told the police he saw Nicholas trying to break into their family's garage, but he'd run off before Jason could catch him. The claim was later debunked, and we'll get more into Jason's role in this case later. For 3 years, Nicholas's family had to live with the painful reality that they had no idea where Nicholas was or what happened to him on the day he vanished. Beverly developed a substance issue, later stating that at the time, all she wanted to do was avoid thinking about Nicholas. And then, in October 1997, they got a call none of them ever expected. Nicholas had been found, and he was alive. In Linares, Spain, a young man had been brought into a youth center, and he identified himself as Nicholas Barclay. He wore baggy clothes, a baseball cap, and sunglasses, all of which hid that this was a 23-year-old man and not a 16-year-old boy. Frederick Borden was born and raised in Nanterre, France. His mom was French, but his dad was Algerian, something that really angered Frederick's grandfather, who was prejudiced towards Algerian people. As a result, growing up, Frederick never felt loved or cared for by his family. His mom resented his existence, and his grandfather was vocal about his hatred towards him. That was when he realized he wanted to be a different person, someone who had a family that loved him and wanted him around. So that's what he did. He'd seen the story of Nicholas's disappearance on TV, and they started researching him. He came up with a story that would fill in any plot holes of his true identity. He said he'd been snatched by an internal ring that put boys like Nicholas into illegal industries. He was taken to Europe and told he could only speak French, which would explain why he had a French accent. To keep his identity hidden, the people holding him captive used a procedure to change his eye color from blue to brown. And in case you're wondering, no, there was no such thing as this procedure at the time. Frederick took other measures too to make his story even more convincing. He bleached his hair blonde like Nicholas's and even gave himself the small tattoos that Nicholas had. Despite how weird this is, I can't deny this guy is committed. Carrie, Nicholas's sister, volunteered to fly out to Spain to meet with the authorities and identify her brother. At the time, Frederick knew he would go to prison as soon as they realized he wasn't Nicholas, and he was fully expecting that to happen when Carrie arrived.
She put herself into so much stress, so much anxiety, so much suffering that she couldn't feel. She went all across the world to get her brother, her missing brother. She couldn't get there and say, "It's not you." She knew I wasn't, but she knew I had to be.
With Carrie Charlie, seemingly convinced that Frederick was her lost brother, arrangements were made to return them both to the United States. Frederick was sure that once he encountered the rest of the family, the game would be up. But once again, that isn't what happened.
He had changed so much. It was like mind-boggling.
To Frederick's surprise, everyone was willing to believe that he was Nicholas Barclay. He'd finally achieved what he'd set out to do, become a different person that belonged to a family that desperately wanted him home. Over the next 5 months, Frederick lived Nicholas's life back in San Antonio. He reunited with his friends and family, took on Nicholas's hobbies, and even started going to school again. You may be thinking, it's not that strange that a family so desperate to have their relative back would overlook all the odd things about this guy claiming to be him. If this were a different case, I'd probably agree. But you just have to look at these two people to see that there's no way they're the same person. Nicholas's age progression photos for his 20s don't resemble Frederick even the tiniest bit. But there was one part of Frederick's appearance that gave the lie away: his ears. Private investigator Charlie Parker was roped into the case by a reporter who hired Charlie to convince the supposed Nicholas Barclay to give them an interview. But Charlie had a hunch that there was something off about Nicholas. The hair and eyes thing was weird, but the change wasn't impossible. However, all of us have two main characteristics that make us unique from other people: our fingerprints and our ears. Since Frederick refused to give the authorities a copy of his fingerprints, Charlie started analyzing photos of the two and comparing the shapes of their ears. They weren't a match. Charlie's first thought was that Frederick was a spy trying to infiltrate the United States. Without knowing what Frederick was really like, this was the theory that made the most sense to him. He contacted Nancy Fisher, an agent at the FBI who was still hunting down this ring that Nicholas had supposedly been taken by. She had no idea how to respond to this information. She couldn't understand how after all this time, the Barclays hadn't realized something was wrong. She decided to take him back to Houston to see a specialist psychiatrist. The plan was to tell the Barclays that they were taking Nicholas there to help him overcome some of his trauma, and the psychiatrist was told this too. In fact, they were trying to catch him out in a lie, and it worked. The psychiatrist knew something was off as soon as Frederick started talking. As he told stories of horrible things that happened to him in Europe, the psychiatrist was struck by how little emotion he expressed. Furthermore, he noticed that Frederick couldn't speak without using a French accent. It was impossible that this individual had spent the first 13 years of his life in an English-speaking home. Concerned for the Barclays' safety, Agent Fisher contacted Carrie and told her that the individual living in her home wasn't her brother. Carrie was devastated. Agent Fisher told her they were flying back to San Antonio tomorrow, but not to meet them at the airport since they could be in danger. But when they landed, there was Carrie acting as if nothing was wrong. This would be the start of the authorities turning on the Barclays. Remember that phone call Jason made about Nicholas breaking into a garage? Doing things like that is common practice among people trying to cover their tracks and maintain the belief that Nicholas is still alive. And what about the call Nicholas made, asking his mom to pick him up? Jason was the one who took that call, and is the only one who can verify he spoke to Nicholas. There was one more thing too. When Frederick was brought into the family, Jason was the only one to doubt his identity. Reportedly, upon meeting, Jason told Frederick, "Good luck," and never spoke to him again. And yet, he never raised his concerns with the authorities. We'll never know if Jason had anything to do with the real Nicholas's disappearance. After being contacted by the FBI, who wanted more information from him, he passed away from an overdose the following day. It's thought that he did this intentionally. Beverly was given a lie detector test after Frederick revealed she told him that Nicholas was dead. She passed 2 tests but failed 1, although this is pretty common with lie detectors. She also refused to give a DNA sample to compare with Frederick's to see if there was any chance he was her son. They didn't need her DNA in the end. Frederick finally gave up his fingerprints to the FBI, which were used to identify him. He was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison. That may not seem like a lot, but that's double the recommended sentence for his charges. There wasn't enough evidence against the Barclays. None of them have ever been charged with causing Nicholas's disappearance, but authorities continued to monitor them. Following his release from prison, Frederick moved back to France, got married, and had 5 children. For years after his release, he still contacted the authorities claiming to be different people, especially missing children, including Leo Bailey, a French teenager who went missing in 1996. He also had several false identities, all of which were revealed either by people recognizing him or due to DNA evidence. His last identity, Francisco Hernandez Fernandez, Nicholas was debunked by his teacher who saw him on TV. After that, he claims to have quit the imposter lifestyle. Why, you might ask?
He adopted a cat.
Nicholas has never been found, and no one knows what happened to him. At least, no one is saying what happened to him. One day, I hope we'll get the closure of knowing what happened all those years ago. That brings us to the end of today's video. What do you guys think of this case? Do you think Nicholas's family could have had something to do with his disappearance? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.